fantasized about escaping the chaos of city life for a weekend in a remote cabin. The idea of disconnecting from the digital world, breathing in the fresh mountain air, and spending my days in utter peace sounded like a dream. So when I found a listing for a cabin that promised isolation, no cell service, and complete seclusion deep in the wilderness, I didn't hesitate to book it. I didn't even tell my friends. I just wanted time to myself. The drive took nearly 5 hours, the last stretch a winding dirt road that seemed to narrow with every mile. I didn't see a single car after I passed through the last tiny town, and I felt a sense of excitement grow as the wilderness thickened around me. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk was starting to settle over the mountains, casting long shadows through the dense trees. It was perfect. The little wooden cabin stood alone on a small clearing, with a view of the forest stretching endlessly behind it. I parked my car and stepped out, feeling the crisp evening air fill my lungs. The silence was almost surreal. No hum of traffic, no chatter of people, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and made my way to the front door. The key was under a loose rock by the steps, just as the owner had said. It was a simple one-room cabin with a tiny kitchen, a fireplace, and a small loft for sleeping, quaint, cozy, and completely isolated. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in for the night. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, nothing but a stack of books and the soft crackle of the fireplace for entertainment. I ate a simple dinner, made a cup of tea, and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as the night deepened around me. The window in front of me showed nothing but darkness, with the faint outline of trees just visible in the firelight. As the night grew colder, I climbed up to the loft, feeling the exhaustion of the long drive settle into my bones. The bed was comfortable, and the blankets were thick and warm. I drifted off almost instantly. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was the remnants of a dream, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the leaves just outside the cabin. I froze, listening, my ears straining against the silence. The sound grew louder, closer, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. There was no one else out here, no one for miles. I waited, holding my breath, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. The footsteps circled the cabin, heavy and purposeful, as though someone was walking in slow circles around the building. I crept out of bed and made my way to the window, careful not to make a sound. I pressed my face to the glass, but there was nothing to see, just darkness. The footsteps stopped. For a moment I stood there, my heart still racing. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a deer or something, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The footsteps had been too measured, too human. I returned to bed, my ears still on high alert. Minutes passed, and just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, a soft knock echoed through the cabin. I shot upright, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and made my way downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, and I paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it, but what choice did I have? I took a deep breath, reached for the doorknob, and slowly pulled it open. There was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the dense forest beyond. But there was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything nearby. The air was still and cold, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind in the leaves. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to think. Was someone messing with me? Had someone followed me out here? I had been so sure that no one knew where I was. I hadn't even told my friends the exact location. I returned to bed, my mind racing, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for hours, listening to the silence, half expecting the footsteps to return. But the night passed without any more disturbances. The next morning I awoke to the sunlight streaming through the window. The events of the night before seemed distant, like a bad dream. Maybe I had imagined it all, I thought. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, hiking through the woods and soaking in the peacefulness of the mountains. It was exactly what I had wanted, a break from the hectic, noisy world. But as the sun began to set again, a sense of unease crept back into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the warmth and light would keep the creeping dread at bay. But as soon as I climbed back into bed, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate. They circled the cabin again, slow and methodical, as if someone was pacing just beyond the reach of the light. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling. I didn't care anymore. I had to see what was out there. I ran to the window and shone the light into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A figure. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, and its limbs were long and spindly. It stood there, motionless, staring back at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. I was completely cut off from the world, trapped in this isolated cabin with whatever that thing was. The footsteps started again, this time right outside the door. I heard a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood. Then the knocking returned, harder, more insistent. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do. If I stayed, whatever it was might break in. But if I left, I'd be wandering through the dark, dense forest with no idea where I was going. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. I had to make a decision. With shaking hands, I grabbed my car keys and made a dash for the back door. I burst out into the cold night, sprinting towards the car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and finally managed to get the door open. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest, the cabin quickly disappearing into the distance. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally stopped to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was reeling. Whatever had been at that cabin, it wasn't human. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never return to those mountains again.
It was a last-minute decision to stop for the night. The drive along the coast had taken longer than expected, and I was too tired to continue. I'd been on a road trip, driving from one beach town to the next, hoping to find some kind of peace after the stress of work and city life had started wearing me down. So, when I spotted the sign for a small seaside inn just off the highway, I pulled over without a second thought. The inn was modest, a little weather-beaten but charming in its way. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a kind smile, handed me the key and told me I'd be in room 212. "You're lucky," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Not many guests this time of year." I didn't think much of it at the time. The place was quiet, and after driving for hours, I was grateful for that. I thanked her and made my way up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking beneath my feet as I walked. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in spots, but it had a certain quaint charm. Room 212 was at the very end of the hall. As soon as I opened the door, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. The room itself seemed ordinary enough, clean, with a simple bed, a small dresser, and an old-fashioned TV. But something was off. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. A cold draft seemed to seep through the window even though it was tightly shut. I dropped my bag on the bed and went to the window, looking out at the ocean below. The waves crashed against the shore, the sky darkening as the sun set over the water. The view was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shaking it off, I closed the curtains and turned on the TV. Static greeted me. I flipped through the channels, but no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't find a single station. Frustrated, I turned it off and decided to take a quick shower. The bathroom was small, with a single light bulb flickering overhead. The mirror was foggy, and the shower head dripped steadily, the sound echoing in the cramped space. I undressed and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water relax my muscles. For a moment, I felt the tension start to ease. That's when I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside the bathroom. I turned off the water, straining to listen. The sound had stopped. I wrapped a towel around myself and stepped out into the room, my heart pounding. The room was exactly as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the door. It was still locked. The window hadn't moved. But that whisper, it had been so clear. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me after hours on the road. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though I wasn't alone. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, until finally, sometime after midnight, I dozed off. I woke suddenly, my heart racing, to the sound of the door creaking open. I sat up, staring at the door. It was still shut, the deadbolt in place. But I had heard it, hadn't I? A slow, deliberate creak, like someone was pushing it open. I got out of bed and checked the door again, feeling the cold metal of the bolt. It hadn't moved. As I turned to go back to bed, something caught my eye, a shadow, flickering just at the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. I grabbed my phone, wanting to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Of course, the one time I needed my phone to work, it was useless. I sat there, feeling utterly alone, the weight of the room pressing in on me. And then, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer. A voice, low and rasping, coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my skin prickling with fear. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there. I slowly turned my head toward the corner, my eyes wide, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there. Just the same empty room. I stood, my legs shaking, and backed toward the door, not daring to take my eyes off that corner. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, like a conversation just out of earshot. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, desperate to get out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened the door and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the front desk, the receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty, eerily quiet in the dead of night. I pounded on the desk, calling out for help, but no one answered. Panicking, I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and left. I didn't care about the time, or the fact that I had nowhere else to go. I just needed to get out of that place. As I drove away, the headlights of my car illuminating the dark, winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The next morning, I called the inn to explain why I had left without checking out. The woman who answered sounded confused. "We haven't had guests in weeks," she said. "We're closed for the season." I hung up, my hands trembling. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that room, but I'll never forget the whispering.
We had rented a beach house for the summer. It was the perfect spot, right on the water, with a view of the ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, meticulously choosing the most picturesque location for what we thought would be a dream vacation. We imagined lazy days surfing and sunbathing, bonfires on the sand, and nights filled with laughter. It was supposed to be the best time of our lives. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The house itself was beautiful, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed the sunlight to pour in, and a massive deck that extended toward the sea like a pathway to serenity. Yet, as breathtaking as the setting was, there was something about the air inside the house. It felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating, like the house was holding on to something unseen, something it didn't want to let go. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my nerves after the long drive, but no matter how much I reasoned with myself, the unease clung to me like a shadow. The first few days passed without incident, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Little things, small, unexplainable events began to pile up. At first, it was easy to laugh them off, a door that was open one moment and inexplicably closed the next. The faint sound of footsteps on the floor above when we were all downstairs. We blamed it on the wind or the house settling, making nervous jokes to mask our growing discomfort. But deep down, we were all starting to feel it, the creeping sense that we weren't alone. The strangeness escalated slowly until the little things no longer felt like quirks of an old house. One night, we were sitting on the deck, watching the sun melt into the horizon in a blaze of fiery orange, the rhythmic sound of the waves providing a peaceful soundtrack to the evening. We were finally relaxing, letting the day's warmth sink into our bones, when the peace shattered. The scream. It ripped through the air like a knife, a shrill, blood-curdling sound that echoed through the walls of the house. We all froze. It was the kind of scream that turned your blood cold, the kind you couldn't mistake for anything else. And yet, there was no one else in the house. There shouldn't have been anyone else. For a moment, none of us moved. It was as if we were collectively holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to explain away the sound. But nothing came. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on us from all sides. My heart was racing, my skin cold despite the warm evening air. Without thinking, I jumped up and ran inside, my feet moving before my brain could fully comprehend the fear that had taken hold of me. The others followed, each of us frantic, searching room after room for the source of the scream. But there was no one. Nothing. The house was empty, just as it had been when we first arrived. We tried to laugh it off, but it was forced, brittle, like glass about to shatter. Maybe it was the wind, we told ourselves. Maybe some strange acoustics with the ocean. But we knew, deep down, that wasn't the answer. Something was wrong with this house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the sound of the waves grew more distant, more muted. The darkness felt thicker than usual, like it was pressing in around me, suffocating me. I don't know how long I lay there, half awake, half dreaming, when I heard it again. The scream, this time, it was closer, more desperate. It sounded like someone was being torn apart, their agony reverberating through the walls. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The others had heard it too. They were already in the hallway, their faces pale and wide-eyed, the terror written plainly across their features. We stood there, listening, the scream echoing through the house, growing louder, more frantic, as though it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. There was something malevolent in that sound, something that made my stomach turn with dread. We searched again, desperately this time, turning over furniture, checking closets, running from room to room like terrified children. But there was still no one there, no explanation, just the deafening silence that followed the scream, as if the house itself was mocking us. That night, felt like it would never end. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I kept expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, something watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air was thick with dread, and I could barely breathe. By morning, we were all exhausted, too shaken to stay another night. We packed our bags in silence, the weight of what we had experienced pressing down on us like a vice. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see something in one of the windows, a face, a figure, anything that could explain the terror that had gripped us. But there was nothing, just the empty windows staring blankly out at the sea. To this day, I don't know what was in that house or why it screamed, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never set foot in that place again.
It was supposed to be a fun day of sightseeing. I had been backpacking through Europe solo for weeks, chasing adventure, and when I heard about a guided tour of an ancient castle on the outskirts of town, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The castle was notorious, not just for its history, but for its dark legends, rumors of hauntings that stretched back centuries. It sounded like a cool, spine-chilling experience, the kind of story I could tell my friends back home. The tour group was small, just me and 5 other travelers. Our guide was an older man, his skin weathered from years under the sun, his accent thick and unfamiliar, but his tone had a gravitas that demanded attention. His demeanor was gruff, his eyes cold, yet there was something oddly magnetic about him. He seemed to know the castle like the back of his hand, rattling off facts and chilling stories as we ventured through the towering gates and into the echoing halls. At first, everything seemed normal, charming even. The castle was breathtaking, with its high, arching stone walls, narrow, winding staircases, and long, weathered tapestries that seemed frozen in time. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. But the deeper we ventured into the castle, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, as if the very air around us thickened, becoming heavier and colder. The light that once filtered in through the windows now appeared dull and weak, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker, more pronounced, almost alive. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that crawled up my spine. The guide's stories also began to shift. He started with tales of noble families and wars, but soon moved on to more sinister accounts. He spoke of the prisoners who were chained and forgotten in the castle's dungeons, left to rot in the dark. He told of ghostly apparitions that were said to roam the halls at night, of people who had entered the castle and never left. The way he recounted these tales was unsettling. His voice dropped lower, becoming almost hypnotic, as if he wasn't merely telling a story, but recalling something personal, something he had seen himself. I wasn't alone in feeling the growing dread. The others in the group had gone quiet, their initial excitement replaced with an eerie stillness. I could see it in their faces, the pale, tense expressions of people trying to rationalize their discomfort but failing. We stayed close together, moving almost in unison as we followed the guide deeper into the bowels of the castle. The turning point came when the guide led us down a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to descend forever. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The walls were slick with moisture, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and decay. The stairwell opened up into the dungeons, dark, cramped cells that lined the walls, their iron bars rusted with age. I felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. The place reeked of suffering, and I could almost hear the cries of those who had once been locked away here. The guide's voice, still calm and measured, echoed off the stone walls as he described how prisoners were tortured here, left in the dark, forgotten, until madness overtook them. His words seemed to hang in the air, almost like a curse. And then I saw it. The guide's shadow, unnatural, wrong. It didn't match his movements. As he spoke, gesturing with his hands, his shadow remained still. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it move. Not in sync with him, but on its own, creeping and slithering along the walls like some kind of dark, sentient thing. It twisted and expanded, growing darker and more distinct, its form shifting into something less human and more monstrous. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe the dim light was playing tricks on my mind. But no, there it was, moving with a malevolence all its own. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the others hadn't noticed yet. They were still listening to the guide's chilling stories, unaware of the shadow looming behind him like a predator. That's when the door to the dungeon slammed shut with a deafening crash. We all jumped, panic rising in an instant. One of the travelers, a young man, rushed to the door and pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, trapping us inside the cold, suffocating darkness of the dungeon. The air felt different now, thick with fear, tinged with the metallic scent of old blood. The guide stood there, his smile widening unnaturally, his eyes glinting with something that made my stomach twist. Behind him, the shadow continued to writhe, growing larger, stretching up the walls like an oil slick spreading across the floor. "You won't be leaving," the guide said, his voice eerily calm, almost cheerful. "Not until they are satisfied." His words sent an icy chill down my spine. They? Who was they? Before I could ask, the whispers began. Faint at first, so soft I could barely hear them. But they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of disembodied voices. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, murmuring with the voices of the damned. The shadows began to shift and take shape. Faces, twisted and contorted in agony, appeared on the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Pale hands reached out from the darkness, clawing at the air, desperate to drag us into whatever hell they had come from. We were surrounded. The other travelers screamed, backing into the center of the room, huddling together in terror. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The shadows reached for us, their cold, intangible fingers brushing against my skin, leaving a freezing numbness in their wake. The guide simply stood there, watching us with that same horrifying smile, as though he was enjoying the spectacle. I don't know how long we were trapped in that dungeon, surrounded by those things, those impossible, writhing shadows. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The voices grew louder, the shadows bolder, until it felt like we would be swallowed whole by the darkness. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door creaked open, the whispers faded, and the shadows slithered back into the walls. The guide gave us a small nod, as if this was all part of the tour, and gestured toward the exit. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in our rush to escape. My heart was still pounding as we ran through the empty halls of the castle, the air thick with the lingering presence of whatever had been down in that dungeon. I didn't look back, not once. I was too terrified of what I might see. When we finally burst out into the daylight, the warmth of the sun felt like a cruel joke. It was as if we had stepped out of one world and into another, a world where the horrors of that castle couldn't reach us. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that dungeon wasn't finished with us, and I have no doubt that if I ever return, it will be waiting.
The lodge was nestled deep in the heart of an ancient forest, miles away from civilization. It was one of those rare, isolated spots where the silence was so absolute, it pressed against your ears, amplifying every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The dense canopy of trees stretched high into the sky, their thick branches knitting together, allowing only occasional shafts of light to pierce through. The isolation was perfect. At least that's what we thought. It had been my idea to rent the lodge, to disconnect from the chaos of the city and immerse ourselves in nature for a week. The promise of crystal-clear lakes, miles of untouched wilderness, and the rustic charm of the sprawling old lodge had been too tempting to resist. The lodge itself was beautiful, with wide wooden beams and large windows that peered out into the surrounding forest like unblinking eyes. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated the main room, its warmth offering comfort in the cool nights, and the scent of pinewood filled the air, grounding us in the wilderness. At first, everything was perfect. We spent our days hiking through the endless woods, exploring hidden trails that snaked through the underbrush. The evenings were spent swimming in the lake, its waters so clear and still that you could see straight to the bottom, where smooth stones and tangled roots lay undisturbed. At night we would sit around the fire pit, the flames dancing in the crisp air, telling stories and laughing until our voices echoed in the stillness. But by the third day, things started to feel off. It began subtly, so subtle that we almost missed it. The animals, for one. The first morning, we woke to find a deer standing just at the edge of the tree line, its tall, antlered head turned toward the lodge. It didn't move, didn't even twitch. It simply stood there, staring at us with wide, dark eyes. At first, we laughed it off. How often do you wake up to a deer in your yard? But there was something unnerving about the way it stood, frozen, almost as if it wasn't really a deer at all, but a statue. The unsettling part was how long it stayed there. Hours passed, and it didn't budge. Even when we clapped or yelled, it remained rooted to the spot, its gaze unwavering. By the afternoon, it had disappeared, and we shrugged it off as a strange encounter. The following day, though, the animals multiplied. Birds gathered in the trees, perched silently in rows. Squirrels and foxes appeared at the forest's edge, sitting motionless as they stared at the lodge with eerie stillness. It was as if the entire forest had come to a standstill, watching us. My friend Sarah, usually the first to crack a joke, muttered something about feeling like we were being studied. We laughed it off nervously, but there was no denying the strange tension in the air. The animals never came closer, never made a sound, but they didn't need to. Their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. On the third night, the footsteps began. It was late, probably close to midnight, and we were gathered around the fireplace in the main room, enjoying the last of the evening's warmth. The windows reflected the flickering flames, creating a strange illusion of fire within the forest. We were mid-conversation when we heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves outside. At first we paused, thinking it might have been one of us, but the sound came again, clear and unmistakable, moving closer, circling the lodge. We all exchanged glances. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. No neighbors, no campers, no trails nearby. Just us and the wilderness. The sound grew louder, more pronounced, as though whoever or whatever was outside wanted to be heard. Sarah, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the large window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the undergrowth, but nothing more. No figures, no animals, nothing. Yet the footsteps continued. We pressed our ears to the window, listening as the sound circled us once more, pacing around the perimeter of the lodge like a predator stalking its prey. My skin prickled with unease, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct screamed that we weren't alone, but still, we saw nothing. That night, sleep was a distant hope. The sound of footsteps echoed in my mind even when they weren't there, an insidious rhythm that played over and over. At some point, I must have drifted off, only to be jolted awake by what sounded like a low whisper outside my window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but chilling enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I didn't dare move, barely breathing as I strained to listen. But the only sound that followed was the wind rustling the leaves outside. By morning, we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found. The ground around the lodge was covered in footprints, dozens of them. They circled the lodge in tight, overlapping loops, as if someone or something had been pacing outside all night long. Some of the prints were human, but others were strange, distorted, as if whoever or whatever had made them was dragging something behind them. The worst part? Some of the footprints led straight up to the windows, where they stopped abruptly as though someone had been standing there, watching us sleep. That was when we made the decision to leave. We packed our bags in a hurried silence, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside setting us on edge. As we loaded up the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere deep in the woods, those animals were still there, their eyes following our every move. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in around us, eager to reclaim us. We drove away, the lodge disappearing into the distance, swallowed by the trees. No one spoke on the ride back to the city. The silence between us was thick with unspoken fear, each of us replaying the strange events over and over in our minds. None of it made sense, and yet, There was no denying the primal terror we had all felt. To this day, I still think about that lodge, about the footsteps in the night and the animals that watched us with too much awareness. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling just outside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I will never, ever go back to that forest.
I was on vacation in a remote part of Eastern Europe, hoping to escape the usual tourist traps and immerse myself in something more authentic. The region was like a forgotten dream, rolling hills draped in mist, dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever, and quaint little villages that felt untouched by time. It was as if I had stepped into a forgotten century, far removed from the modern world. I had rented a small, secluded cottage on the outskirts of a quiet village, the kind of place where life moved at a slower pace. The locals were friendly, but kept to themselves, speaking in a dialect that I barely understood. And I appreciated the isolation. I thought the solitude was exactly what I needed, until it became something more sinister. One afternoon, I decided to take a long hike through the countryside. The sky was overcast, the air crisp and cool, with an eerie stillness hanging in the atmosphere. Perfect weather for exploring, I told myself, as I set off down a dirt road that meandered through the forest. The deeper I walked, the quieter the world around me became. The trees pressed in from all sides, their branches twisted like ancient skeletal fingers. After a few hours, I came upon something unexpected. A village. At first glance, it seemed no different from any other village I had passed through on my travels. Small, thatched roof cottages, a crumbling stone church with a steeple that reached toward the sky, and narrow cobblestone streets lined with moss and weeds. But something about this village was wrong, deeply wrong. There was no sound, no people, no movement at all. It was as if the entire place had been frozen in time, abandoned, yet somehow not empty. I hesitated at the edge of the village, a wave of unease crawling up my spine. The silence felt oppressive, as though the very air was thick with a presence I couldn't see. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk away. But curiosity has a way of overriding fear, and I found myself stepping onto the cobblestone street. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I wandered deeper into the village, the decay became more apparent. The windows of the houses were shattered, their wooden doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. Inside, I could see furniture, long abandoned, slowly rotting away. The air smelled faintly of mold and damp earth. Grass and weeds had overtaken the streets, growing tall and wild, as if nature was in the process of reclaiming the village. But there was no sign of life, no animals, no insects, not even the wind stirred the leaves. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Every house I passed seemed worse than the last, as though whatever had driven the people from this place had left a taint behind, something malevolent that clung to the walls like a dark stain. In one house, I spotted a small child's doll lying on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. It gave me a sickening sense of dread, as if I had stumbled upon a relic from a family that had fled in a panic and never returned. I pressed on, drawn toward the church that loomed in the center of the village. Its doors, heavy and slightly ajar, creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was colder, mustier, as if the building itself was holding on to something long dead. The faint smell of decay lingered, thick and cloying. The walls were cracked, the ceiling warped with age, and yet the church felt more intact than the rest of the village. I walked down the narrow aisle, my footsteps echoing ominously. Empty wooden pews lined the room, and at the far end stood a stone altar, bare except for a thick layer of dust. Behind the altar was a mural, old and faded, but still discernible. As I approached, the details came into focus, and my blood ran cold. The mural depicted a group of people standing in a circle around something in the center, something dark, shadowy, and indistinct. Their faces were twisted in expressions of sheer terror, their hands raised either in prayer or in a desperate attempt to ward off whatever was at the heart of the circle. The more I looked at it, the more the figures seemed to come alive, their wide eyes staring back at me, pleading for help. The figure in the center of the mural was blurred, almost as if time itself had erased its features, but the darkness around it seemed to pulse with something ancient, something hungry. Suddenly I felt a cold breeze brush the back of my neck. My skin prickled with fear. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. But the church was empty. The open door let in a sliver of pale, dying light from the overcast sky, but the temperature had plummeted. I could feel it. Something was here with me. Panic surged through me, and I turned back toward the door, desperate to leave. But as I moved, the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. And then I heard it. A faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing, like voices carried on the wind. The sound was too faint to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, terrified. I bolted from the church, the whispering growing louder in my ears, like a rising tide of voices clawing at my sanity. By the time I reached the street, my chest was heaving with panic, but the nightmare wasn't over. The village had changed. The houses, already decaying, now seemed to sag into the earth, as though they were being consumed by the ground itself. The air was thick with a sickening sense of dread, and the whispering followed me, soft at first, then louder, insistent, like a chorus of the damned. I began to run. As I neared the edge of the village, something caught my eye, a movement in one of the windows of a crumbling house. I stopped, heart pounding, and stared. For a split second, I saw it, a shadowy figure, standing motionless in the window, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, glowing faintly in the gloom. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, locking me in place. A wave of cold washed over me, freezing me to the spot. Then the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I sprinted into the forest, the trees closing in around me, their twisted branches like skeletal arms reaching out to pull me back. The whispering followed me, relentless, until finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached the edge of the woods. I glanced back once more at the village, now swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The houses seemed to melt into the earth, and where I had seen the figure, there was only blackness. I stumbled back to my cottage, my legs weak and shaking. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mural, the faces of those twisted figures staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, and the shadow in the center, waiting to consume them. I left the village the next morning, cutting my trip short. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe that a village like that could exist, a place where time had stopped, where the dead whispered and shadows watched? But even now, miles away, the image of that figure still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And in the silence, I can still hear the faintest whispers, growing closer.
The cliffside retreat was supposed to be the highlight of my vacation, a secluded sanctuary far removed from the stresses of daily life. Nestled high above the crashing waves, it offered panoramic views of the endless ocean with nothing but the sea and the sky stretching to the horizon. I'd stumbled upon the rental online, an undiscovered gem hidden far from the well-trodden tourist paths. It promised peace, serenity, and, most importantly, total privacy. When I arrived, it seemed every bit as perfect as the photos. The house was breathtaking, a sleek, modern design of glass and steel that blended seamlessly into the cliffside. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, providing uninterrupted views of the ocean below. The deck jutted out over the cliff's edge, making it feel like I was floating above the water, and the infinity pool mirrored the sea, creating the illusion that it stretched right into the horizon. Miles from the nearest town, there was nothing but the endless rhythm of the waves crashing far below. For the first couple of days, I thought I had found paradise. I spent hours lounging by the pool, reading on the deck, and watching the sun melt into the water each evening. The isolation was comforting at first, the silence a soothing escape from the relentless noise of city life. But by the third night, things began to change. It started as I sat on the deck after dinner, a glass of wine in hand, savoring the quiet. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading to a deep purple, the stars beginning to prick through the darkening canvas. The waves below, which had been a constant background noise since I arrived, suddenly grew louder, much louder. It wasn't a gradual change, but a sharp increase, like someone had cranked up the volume on a speaker. I stood up, frowning, and walked to the edge of the deck, peering down at the water far below. It looked different, darker, more violent. The waves were no longer lapping gently against the rocks, but crashing with a force that sent spray high into the air. The ocean's once steady rhythm had become chaotic, and I could feel a strange vibration beneath my feet, as though the very cliff I stood on was trembling. A sense of unease settled over me, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe the weather was changing, or it was just some kind of natural tide shift. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I walked back inside the house, locking the sliding glass doors behind me. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. A knock. At first I thought it was my imagination. It was faint, barely audible over the wind and the crashing waves. But then it came again, louder this time, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. I sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, a steady knock, 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 coming from the far side of the room. My stomach twisted in knots. I knew that window. It was on the second floor, high above the ground, with nothing but sheer cliff below it. No one could possibly be outside that window. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. My skin prickled with fear, my mouth dry as I slowly climbed out of bed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to hide, but I couldn't help myself. I crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The curtains were drawn, but the knocking was relentless now, rapid, almost frantic. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. I hesitated, every nerve in my body on edge. Finally, with a deep breath, I yanked it back. Nothing. The window looked out onto the dark night, the faint outline of the ocean barely visible beneath the moonless sky. But there was no one there, no face, no figure, just the empty void beyond the glass. Yet the knocking continued. I staggered back, my pulse racing. It was impossible. No one could be knocking on that window, not at this height. Panic surged through me and I stumbled toward the door, grabbing my phone as I went. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number for the retreat's owner. It was late and I half expected the call to go straight to voicemail, but after a few rings he picked up. His voice was groggy, confused. "Hello?" I tried to steady my voice as I explained what was happening, the knocking, the strange noises, the unnatural waves. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a low, serious tone, he spoke. "You need to leave. Now." The calmness in his voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "Just listen to me. Get out of the house right now." His voice was firm, almost urgent. "Do not wait. Get out before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. My adrenaline surged and I grabbed whatever I could, shoving clothes into my bag with frantic hands. The knocking grew even louder now, almost thunderous, echoing through the house as if it were pounding in my very skull. I could feel it in the walls, reverberating with a terrifying force. As I rushed down the stairs, I glanced through the massive windows that overlooked the ocean. My stomach lurched at the sight. The sea was alive with chaos. The once calm waters had transformed into a boiling, churning maelstrom, the waves crashing violently against the cliffs, sending plumes of salt water high into the air. The horizon itself seemed to tilt and shift, as though the ocean was being pulled into some unseen abyss. and in the darkness beyond the waves, I saw shapes, indistinct figures, moving beneath the surface of the water, writhing and twisting in unnatural ways. I bolted for the front door, barely managing to shove it open against the force of the wind that had begun to howl outside. The moment I stepped outside, the knocking stopped, but the feeling of dread only intensified. I could feel something watching me, its presence thick and oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I threw my bag into the car and peeled out of the driveway, my tires skidding on the gravel as I sped away from the house. The road was narrow and winding, and I barely kept control as I navigated the sharp turns. The ocean, now hidden by the darkness, still roared behind me as though the very sea itself was coming for me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the nearest town where the lights of civilization felt like a lifeline. I parked in front of a small hotel and sat in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I tried calling the owner again, but the line was dead, disconnected. I never found out what was happening at that retreat, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was knocking on that window, whatever was rising from the depths of that ocean, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the faintest knock, knock, knock in the distance.
We had booked a boat tour to a small remote island off the coast. It was advertised as a hidden paradise, far from the crowds, a place where time seemed to stand still. Known for its untouched beauty and secluded beaches, the island seemed like the perfect escape. The idea of a relaxing day, cut off from the world, was exactly what I had hoped for. The boat was small, just enough for the few of us on board. Aside from me, there was a young couple on their honeymoon, and our guide, a local man in his 30s, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet demeanor. He had lived in the area all his life, navigating the waters like second nature. The boat ride was serene. The sky was cloudless, the sun blazing above us, and the sea was calm, a brilliant crystal blue that shimmered in the light. The island came into view slowly, emerging from the horizon like a dream. White sand beaches and towering palm trees framed the shoreline, their shadows dancing across the clear waters. It was paradise. We docked at a small cove, the guide securing the boat while we disembarked. The moment I set foot on the beach, I felt a sense of overwhelming peace, as though the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The air was warm and salty, the ocean breeze refreshing. The young couple wasted no time setting up for a beach picnic, laughing and posing for photos, while I wandered the shoreline, marveling at how untouched everything seemed. For the first half of the day, everything was perfect. I swam in the warm waters, basked in the sun, and explored the winding paths through the dense foliage. The island was entirely deserted, just as the brochure had promised. No other tourists, no other boats, just us and nature. But by mid-afternoon, something began to change. I first noticed it in the guide. He had been friendly enough when we arrived, sharing local stories and pointing out landmarks on the island. But now, his behavior shifted. His once easygoing demeanor became tense, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the horizon beyond the beach. It was subtle at first, a quick glance over his shoulder, a furrowed brow, but it became more pronounced as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the sky had started to change, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the island. The couple was still enjoying themselves, laughing and taking photos, but the guide seemed agitated, pacing near the boat, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. I approached him, trying to gauge what was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He forced a tight smile, though his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing to worry about," he said quickly, but his voice was tense, the forced calm doing little to hide his unease. I looked around, noticing how the atmosphere of the island had shifted. What had been idyllic and serene just hours ago now felt oppressive, the air thicker, heavier. Even the sounds of the ocean seemed different, the waves crashing harder against the shore, a deep, rumbling undertone vibrating beneath the earth. The shadows cast by the palm trees seemed unnaturally long, stretching out across the sand like dark fingers, reaching for us. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the guide's urgency grew. He kept glancing at his watch, muttering under his breath, and pacing near the boat as though he couldn't wait to leave. Finally, as the sky began to turn a deep orange, he approached the couple and me, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice strained with urgency. The couple hesitated, clearly reluctant to cut their day short. "Just a few more photos," the woman said, holding up her phone. "It's almost sunset." "No." The guide's voice was sharper now, almost frantic. "We can't stay here after dark. It's not safe." The way he said it, his tone, the look in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. The couple finally relented, sensing the tension, and we began packing up. I hurriedly gathered my things, my heart starting to race as I glanced back at the tree line. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and thin, darting between the trees. My pulse quickened, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. We made our way back to the boat as the sky darkened rapidly, the sun sinking below the horizon faster than seemed natural. The once vibrant island was now cloaked in deep shadows, and a cold wind had begun to blow in from the sea. The waves, once gentle, now crashed violently against the shore, as though the ocean itself had turned hostile. As we boarded the boat, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it again. Something moving. A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, watching as the figure stepped out from the shadows and onto the beach. It was impossible to make out its features, but its silhouette was unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down unnaturally long by its sides. It stood perfectly still, watching us. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, as we pushed off from the shore. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The guide's eyes were locked on the figure, his face pale with fear. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and without a word, he gunned the engine, steering the boat away from the island as fast as it could go. The island grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. But even as we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I looked back one last time, and there, standing at the water's edge, was the figure. It hadn't moved. It simply stood there, watching us leave, its form barely visible against the darkening sky. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned back to the guide, my voice trembling. What was that?" The guide didn't answer at first. He just stared straight ahead, his face ashen. After a long moment, he muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't understand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with fear. "That island," he said, his eyes never leaving the horizon, "is cursed. It's not a place for us. We were never meant to be there." The boat sped faster, cutting through the rough water. I sat in silence, too terrified to ask any more questions, the couple now quiet as well, having sensed the shift in the air. As we neared the mainland, the guide's tension never lessened. Even as the island faded into the distance, it felt like it still had a hold on us, like we had barely escaped whatever waited there after dark. When we finally docked, the guide tied the boat hastily, urging us off without a word of goodbye. I watched him disappear into the night, his steps hurried, as if he couldn't put enough distance between himself and the sea. I haven't been back to that island since, but I dream of it. Nightmares where I'm back on the beach, the sun sinking low, and the figure standing at the edge of the water, waiting, always waiting. And in those dreams, I know, this time I won't escape.
We had booked a boat tour to a small, remote island off the coast. It was advertised as a hidden paradise, far from the crowds, a place where time seemed to stand still. Known for its untouched beauty and secluded beaches, the island seemed like the perfect escape. The idea of a relaxing day, cut off from the world, was exactly what I had hoped for. The boat was small, just enough for the few of us on board. Aside from me, there was a young couple on their honeymoon, and our guide, a local man in his 30s, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet demeanor. He had lived in the area all his life, navigating the waters like second nature. The boat ride was serene. The sky was cloudless, the sun blazing above us, and the sea was calm, a brilliant crystal blue that shimmered in the light. The island came into view slowly, emerging from the horizon like a dream. White sand beaches and towering palm trees framed the shoreline, their shadows dancing across the clear waters. It was paradise. We docked at a small cove, the guide securing the boat while we disembarked. The moment I set foot on the beach, I felt a sense of overwhelming peace, as though the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The air was warm and salty, the ocean breeze refreshing. The young couple wasted no time setting up for a beach picnic, laughing and posing for photos, while I wandered the shoreline, marveling at how untouched everything seemed. For the first half of the day, everything was perfect. I swam in the warm waters, basked in the sun, and explored the winding paths through the dense foliage. The island was entirely deserted, just as the brochure had promised. No other tourists, no other boats, just us and nature. But by mid-afternoon, something began to change. I first noticed it in the guide. He had been friendly enough when we arrived, sharing local stories and pointing out landmarks on the island. But now his behavior shifted. His once easygoing demeanor became tense, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the horizon beyond the beach. It was subtle at first, a quick glance over his shoulder, a furrowed brow, but it became more pronounced as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the sky had started to change, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the island. The couple was still enjoying themselves, laughing and taking photos, but the guide seemed agitated, pacing near the boat, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. I approached him, trying to gauge what was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He forced a tight smile, though his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing to worry about," he said quickly, but his voice was tense, the forced calm doing little to hide his unease. I looked around, noticing how the atmosphere of the island had shifted. What had been idyllic and serene just hours ago now felt oppressive, the air thicker, heavier. Even the sounds of the ocean seemed different, the waves crashing harder against the shore, a deep, rumbling undertone vibrating beneath the earth. The shadows cast by the palm trees seemed unnaturally long, stretching out across the sand like dark fingers, reaching for us. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the guide's urgency grew. He kept glancing at his watch, muttering under his breath and pacing near the boat as though he couldn't wait to leave. Finally, as the sky began to turn a deep orange, he approached the couple and me, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice strained with urgency. The couple hesitated, clearly reluctant to cut their day short. "Just a few more photos," the woman said, holding up her phone. "It's almost sunset." "No." The guide's voice was sharper now, almost frantic. "We can't stay here after dark. It's not safe." The way he said it, his tone, the look in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. The couple finally relented, sensing the tension, and we began packing up. I hurriedly gathered my things, my heart starting to race as I glanced back at the tree line. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and thin, darting between the trees. My pulse quickened, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. We made our way back to the boat as the sky darkened rapidly, the sun sinking below the horizon faster than seemed natural. The once vibrant island was now cloaked in deep shadows, and a cold wind had begun to blow in from the sea. The waves, once gentle, now crashed violently against the shore, as though the ocean itself had turned hostile. As we boarded the boat, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it again. Something moving, a figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, watching as the figure stepped out from the shadows and onto the beach. It was impossible to make out its features, but its silhouette was unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down unnaturally long by its sides. It stood perfectly still, watching us. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, as we pushed off from the shore. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The guide's eyes were locked on the figure, his face pale with fear. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and without a word he gunned the engine, steering the boat away from the island as fast as it could go. The island grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. But even as we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I looked back one last time, and there, standing at the water's edge, was the figure. It hadn't moved. It simply stood there, watching us leave, its form barely visible against the darkening sky. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned back to the guide, my voice trembling. What was that?" The guide didn't answer at first. He just stared straight ahead, his face ashen. After a long moment, he muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't understand. Finally he spoke, his voice low and filled with fear. "That island," he said, his eyes never leaving the horizon, "is cursed. It's not a place for us. We were never meant to be there." The boat sped faster, cutting through the rough water. I sat in silence, too terrified to ask any more questions, the couple now quiet as well, having sensed the shift in the air. As we neared the mainland, the guide's tension never lessened. Even as the island faded into the distance, it felt like it still had a hold on us, like we had barely escaped whatever waited there after dark. When we finally docked, the guide tied the boat hastily, urging us off without a word of goodbye. I watched him disappear into the night. His steps hurried, as if he couldn't put enough distance between himself and the sea. I haven't been back to that island since, but I dream of it. Nightmares where I'm back on the beach, the sun sinking low, and the figure standing at the edge of the water, waiting, always waiting. And in those dreams, I know, this time, I won't escape.
The locals had warned us not to swim in the lagoon. They didn't tell us why, just that it wasn't safe, and that we should steer clear of its waters. But we were stubborn. We were on vacation, a group of thrill seekers used to ignoring superstitions and local folklore in search of adventure. The crystalline water was too inviting, the secluded cove too picturesque to resist. It was hidden away, surrounded by thick jungle, a place that felt like it had been waiting for us to discover it. The sky was clear, the sun high above us, and the lagoon seemed like paradise. There were 6 of us, close friends who had traveled together for years, always seeking out the most beautiful remote spots. Our group had found the lagoon by chance during a long hike through the jungle. After hours of trekking in the heat, the shimmering blue water had beckoned us like a mirage. It was perfect, calm, serene, untouched. We felt like we had stumbled upon something magical, and in our excitement, we ignored the locals' warnings. As soon as we dove into the lagoon, it was like the rest of the world fell away. The water was cool and refreshing, its clarity almost unreal. We swam for hours, laughing, splashing, and lounging on the smooth rocks that lined the shore. It was the kind of place you could lose track of time, where the worries of everyday life felt like distant memories. For a while, it truly felt like paradise. But then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, something shifted. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the jungle around us seemed to close in. The water, once sparkling and clear, now appeared darker, murky. The stillness of the lagoon became unnerving, as if the water was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We should head back," someone suggested, but there was an edge to their voice, a nervousness we hadn't felt before. We climbed out of the water, grabbing our towels and preparing to hike back to the campsite. That's when Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see her stumble backward, her hand clamped around her leg. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed to a long, deep scratch that ran from her ankle to her knee, the skin torn as though something had raked its claws through her flesh. Blood trickled down her leg, staining the sand beneath her feet. "What the hell?" I whispered, kneeling beside her. We examined her leg, but there was no explanation for the wound. The water had been calm and we hadn't seen any sharp rocks or debris. There was nothing in the lagoon that could have caused an injury like that. Nothing visible, at least. "It's fine," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. "It's just a scratch." But the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe her own words. We tried to shake it off as we gathered our things and made our way back to camp, but the atmosphere had changed. The jungle, once vibrant with the sounds of birds and insects, had fallen eerily silent. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of dread that none of us could shake. Every step we took seemed to echo, and the trees cast long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us, as if the jungle itself was alive, watching us. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Sarah's condition worsened. The scratch on her leg, which had seemed minor at first, had started to swell. The skin around it turned an angry red, and she complained of a burning sensation that spread up her leg. She shivered even though the night was warm and sticky with humidity. We wrapped her in blankets, but nothing seemed to help. Her teeth chattered and her skin grew paler by the minute. "Maybe we should head back to the village," I suggested. But the village was miles away, and the jungle was dangerous to navigate at night. Still, something about Sarah's condition felt wrong, unnatural. She was sweating, mumbling incoherently. Her eyes glazed over with fear. Her hand trembled as she clutched at her leg, but the wound looked worse now. Dark veins seemed to be spreading from the scratch, creeping up her skin like some kind of infection. By midnight, Sarah was no longer herself. Her eyes had taken on a wild, haunted look, darting around the campsite as though she could see something none of us could. She thrashed in her sleeping bag, muttering in a language that didn't sound like her own voice, her body rigid and tense. We tried to hold her down, to comfort her, but nothing worked. It was as if something had taken hold of her, something we couldn't see or understand. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin cold to the touch, and just before dawn she went still. For a moment we thought it was over, that she had passed out from exhaustion. But when we tried to wake her, she didn't respond. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes half open but unseeing, and her pulse was weak, barely there. Panic set in, and we decided to carry her back to the village, hoping someone there could help. As we approached the edge of the lagoon, Sarah let out a terrible, inhuman scream. Her eyes flew open, wide and wild, and she began convulsing violently, her body twisting in ways that seemed impossible. We tried to hold on to her, but she broke free with a strength that shouldn't have been possible, her face contorted with terror. Without warning, she bolted toward the lagoon, running with an unnatural speed, her body moving like a puppet on strings. "Sarah, no!" we shouted, chasing after her, but it was too late. She plunged into the water, disappearing beneath the surface without a sound. As if the lagoon had swallowed her whole, we searched for hours, calling her name, diving into the water, desperately trying to find her. But the lagoon was dark now, its depths impenetrable, and there was no trace of Sarah. She was gone as if she had never been there at all. The next morning, we stumbled back to the village, dazed and terrified. When we told the locals what had happened, their faces turned grim. They told us that the lagoon was cursed, that its waters were hungry for souls. They said it had been that way for generations, that those who entered the lagoon often did not return. The scratches, they explained, were a warning, a mark that meant the lagoon had chosen its victim. We were lucky, they said, lucky to have escaped with our lives. To this day, I can still hear Sarah's scream echoing in my nightmares. The memory of her pale, haunted face as she ran into the water haunts me. I don't know what took her or where she went, but I know one thing for certain. Whatever is in that lagoon is still waiting, still hungry, and I'll never go near those waters again.
It started like any other day. The intercom buzzed, and Principal Thompson's calm voice filled the school. Attention, all students and staff, we are going into lockdown. This is not a drill. My heart skipped a beat. I was in Mr. Hayes' math class, 3rd period. The fluorescent lights above us flickered slightly as the news sank in. Mr. Hayes, usually composed, had a fleeting look of panic before he pulled down the blackout shades and motioned for us to huddle in the corner away from the door. We obeyed without question. The door was locked with a heavy click, the lights switched off, and we were plunged into a darkness that was more psychological than physical. The only light came from the thin slivers that escaped through the cracks of the shades. We were used to drills, but something about this felt off. There was no chatter, no awkward giggles that usually accompanied these exercises. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Minutes ticked by, and the silence grew more oppressive. Then, faintly, a sound. It was hard to place at first, a sort of muffled thumping. It grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty halls. We exchanged glances, fear in our eyes. Mr. Hayes raised a finger to his lips, his expression stern. We stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew closer. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The slow, rhythmic cadence was unnerving. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there would hear it. Then came the whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs, almost like a conversation between two people. It sent chills down my spine. But when I strained to listen, it seemed like the whispers weren't coming from just outside the door, but from all around us. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder, overlapping, filling the room with an oppressive weight. I opened my eyes and saw my classmates' faces, pale and strained, reflecting my own fear. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside our door. The doorknob rattled, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Mr. Hayes stood up, inching towards the door as quietly as possible. The rattling continued, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud bang, something struck the door. We all jumped, a few gasping in shock. The door shuddered under the impact, but thankfully held. A faint sound, like a dragging noise, followed. Whatever was out there seemed to move away, the dragging sound fading down the hall. Mr. Hayes looked back at us, his face ashen but determined. We waited in silence, the air thick with tension. The whispers had ceased, and all that remained was the eerie stillness. It felt like hours before the intercom crackled to life again. "Attention, all students and staff." Principal Thompson's voice was shaky, barely recognizable. "The lockdown is over. You may resume normal activities." Mr. Hayes hesitated, then slowly turned the lights back on. The relief was palpable, but it didn't erase the fear that still gripped us. We all knew something was very wrong, but we were too shaken to speak. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I noticed something odd. The door, the one that had been locked, now had deep gouges in the wood, like something had clawed at it. I looked at Mr. Hayes, but he just shook his head as if urging me not to ask. We filed out of the classroom, and as I stepped into the hallway, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The hallways were eerily empty, the usual bustle of students absent. I could still hear the faint echoes of those whispers in my mind, and I knew that whatever had happened today was far from over. The school was never the same after that. Strange things continued to happen. A locker would suddenly burst open with nothing inside. The lights would flicker without reason, and students swore they heard whispers when no one was around. Teachers and staff brushed it off as nerves, but we all knew the truth. Something had entered our school during that lockdown, something that should never have been let in. And even though we tried to go back to normal, the silence in the hallways was always there, reminding us of the terror that lurked just out of sight.
The announcement came during 5th period, right after lunch. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Miss Jensen's history class froze as the message repeated. She moved swiftly, closing the blinds and locking the door, her hands trembling only slightly. We all moved to the designated corner of the room, huddling together like animals seeking warmth. I sat between my best friend Alex and a girl I barely knew from gym class. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. After what felt like an eternity, I glanced at my phone. No messages, no updates. The school's Wi-Fi was down, and the silence outside the classroom felt unnatural. Usually you'd hear the shuffling of feet or the faint murmur of distant voices, but now, there was nothing. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. My mind wandered, thinking of every possible scenario. Was it an intruder? A shooter? My heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. Then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, and a collective gasp escaped us. Miss Jensen's voice, usually so confident, trembled as she whispered for us to stay calm. That's when we saw it. A faint red glow coming from the door's window. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. It illuminated the hallway beyond in a dim, eerie hue. We all stared at it, transfixed. The red light seemed to throb, growing brighter and then dimming rhythmically. It cast strange, distorted shadows through the small window, shadows that moved in unnatural ways. Miss Jensen slowly got up, motioning for us to stay put as she crept towards the door. She peered through the window, and I saw her face pale as if the blood had been drained from it. She stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth, and the look in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Pure terror. "What is it?" Alex whispered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she backed away from the door, her gaze fixed on the window. The red light grew brighter, almost painfully so, forcing us to look away. But something compelled me to look back, to see what was causing it. That's when I noticed the shapes in the hallway. They weren't shadows. They were figures. Human-like, but wrong. Their limbs were elongated, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. Their eyes, or at least where their eyes should have been, glowed with the same red light. They moved slowly, methodically, their heads turning as if searching for something. And then, one of them stopped in front of our door. It raised a hand, a long, bony finger tapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it sent a shockwave of fear through the room. No one dared move or breathe. The tapping continued, growing more insistent, almost impatient. Then, the handle of the door began to rattle, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Miss Jensen stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The rattling grew louder, more violent, but the door held. Suddenly the red glow began to fade, the figures retreating into the darkness of the hallway. The tapping ceased, and all that remained was the oppressive silence. We stayed huddled together, too afraid to move, even after the lights flickered back on. When the announcement came that the lockdown was over, none of us moved. It took several minutes before Miss Jensen found the courage to unlock the door. The hallway was empty. the red glow gone, as if it had never existed. But the fear lingered, a dark cloud that would not lift. In the days that followed, rumors spread about what had happened. Some said it was a gas leak, others that it was a test gone wrong. But we all knew the truth, even if we didn't speak of it. The school was different after that day. There were whispers of strange occurrences, students disappearing for hours with no memory of where they'd been, and that red glow occasionally seen in the darkest corners of the building. We tried to go back to normal, but every time I passed by that classroom, I could feel the unease creeping back in. The memory of those figures, those distorted shadows, haunted my every step, a constant reminder that something sinister had entered our world and was still out there, waiting for the next moment to strike. It was the middle of sixth period when the announcement came. Students and staff, we are now in lockdown. Please secure your rooms immediately. The voice was unfamiliar, not our usual principal's calm tone. It was robotic, almost inhuman, and it sent a chill down my spine. Mrs. Carter, our English teacher, quickly locked the door and pulled down the blinds, her movements stiff and mechanical. She ordered us to the corner, her voice lacking its usual warmth. The room was filled with an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old school building. The blinds didn't block out all the light, leaving a faint, ghostly glow that barely illuminated the faces around me. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, mirroring my own. As we huddled together, I noticed something odd. The walls seemed off. The familiar cream-colored paint appeared darker, as if a shadow was slowly creeping across it. I blinked, thinking it was just my imagination. But when I looked again, the shadow had grown. My heart raced. I nudged my friend Jessica, pointing to the wall. She squinted, then gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The others noticed too, their eyes widening in horror. The shadows on the walls weren't just spreading, they were moving, slowly, methodically, like ink bleeding across paper. And within the shadows, shapes began to form. Dark, indistinct shapes that writhed and shifted, growing clearer with each passing second. Eyes, hundreds of them, all sizes, blinking and staring at us from the walls. They weren't human eyes. They were too large, too luminous, with pupils that seemed to spiral inward. They darted around the room, settling on each of us in turn, studying us, analyzing us. I could hear the shallow, panicked breaths of my classmates, the soft whimpers of those too scared to keep silent. Mrs. Carter stood frozen at the front of the room, her eyes locked on the wall behind us. Her face was pale, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of her desk. The eyes seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their movements hypnotic, drawing me in. I felt a strange compulsion to stand up, to move closer to the wall, to let them see me more clearly. I fought the urge, biting down on my lip until I tasted blood. Suddenly the intercom crackled to life again, that same robotic voice filling the room. Attention, do not engage, do not look directly at them. Too late. We had already looked, and now we couldn't look away. The eyes began to move closer, the shadows extending towards us like tendrils. I could feel the coldness emanating from them, a deep, bone-chilling cold that made my teeth chatter. The room was suffocating, the air thick with fear. Jessica squeezed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me grounded, kept me from succumbing to the overwhelming terror. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the eyes began to fade, retreating into the walls. The shadows receded, and the room slowly returned to its normal state. But the sense of dread remained, hanging heavy in the air. The intercom buzzed again, but this time it was the principal's voice, shaky and unsure. The lockdown is over. Please proceed to your next class. No one moved. We were too stunned, too shaken to even comprehend what had just happened. Mrs. Carter finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, telling us to gather our things and leave quietly. As I stood up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The hallway was eerily silent as we filed out of the classroom, everyone moving in a daze. In the days that followed, no one spoke about what had happened. There were no explanations, no announcements, just a heavy silence that lingered like a storm cloud, But I knew, we all knew, that whatever those eyes were, they weren't gone. They were still there, hiding in the walls, watching us with their cold, unblinking gaze. And every time I walked past that classroom, I could feel them, just out of sight, waiting for the next time they would emerge from the shadows and remind us that we were never truly alone.
I had always been invisible. The guy no one noticed, the one who always faded into the background. I never had any friends, never fit in anywhere. I was just there. But everything changed the night I watched Terrifier. I didn't know what to expect. I thought it would be just another horror movie, something to pass the time. But then I saw him. Art the Clown. He wasn't like any other killer I'd ever seen. He was silent, his actions deliberate and calculated. There was something about him, something in his eyes, in his smile that spoke to me. It was like he understood what it was like to be invisible, to be nothing. But unlike me, he didn't let it define him. He embraced it. He became a force of nature, a living nightmare. I was obsessed. I watched the movie over and over, studying his every move, every expression. I wanted to understand him, to know what made him tick. I wanted to be like him, to have that kind of power, that kind of control. I started practicing in front of the mirror, mimicking his expressions, his movements. I even made my own costume, a dirty white jumpsuit with black accents just like his. I painted my face with care, creating the same unsettling grin that Art wore. I became him. My first kill was a homeless man who lived under a bridge near my apartment. He was an easy target. No one would miss him. I watched him for days, learning his habits, his patterns. He was always alone, always drunk or high. It would be easy. One night, when the streets were quiet and empty, I approached him. He was asleep, huddled under a thin blanket, his face hidden in the shadows. I stood over him for a moment, feeling the anticipation build inside me, the excitement coursing through my veins. I had a small hatchet in my hand, its blade sharp and ready. I lifted it high above my head, feeling the weight of it, the way it felt in my hand. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the blood rushing through my veins. I brought the hatchet down with a force that surprised even me, the blade sinking into his skull with a dull thud. His body jerked, his eyes flying open in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream. I pulled the hatchet free, blood spraying onto my face, warm and sticky, and swung again, and again, and again. I didn't stop until his head was nothing but a mangled mess, his blood pooling around me, soaking into the ground. I felt alive. The rush of adrenaline, the power coursing through my veins. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I looked down at the body, at the pool of blood spreading out beneath it, and I smiled. I was Art. I was bringing his art to life. I wanted more. I needed more. I moved on to bigger targets, a local grocery store, a random family. I didn't care who they were. They were just props in my masterpiece. I carved my way through the town, each kill more brutal, more creative than the last. I left behind a trail of bodies, each one marked with Art's signature smile, painted in their own blood. The town was in a panic. The news called me a monster, a psychopath. But they didn't understand. They didn't see the beauty in what I was doing. They didn't see the art. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer an outsider. I was Art the Clown, and the world would remember me. My next target was a young woman who worked at a coffee shop downtown. I had been watching her for weeks, learning her routines, her habits. She always left work late, always took the same route home. It would be easy. I waited for her in the shadows, my heart racing with anticipation. I could see her coming, her footsteps echoing off the walls of the narrow alley. She was alone, just like I had planned. I stepped out from the shadows, my costume blending in with the darkness, my face painted with Art's signature smile. She saw me and froze, her eyes wide with fear. I could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her, my eyes locked on hers, my smile widening. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could see the terror in her eyes, the realization that she was about to die. I stepped closer, my footsteps slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. She tried to run, but I was faster. I grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back with a force that sent her sprawling to the ground. She tried to crawl away, her hands scraping against the rough pavement, but I was on her in an instant. I raised the hatchet above my head, feeling the weight of it, the way it felt in my hand, and brought it down with all my might. The blade sank into her back with a sickening crunch, the sound of bone and flesh giving way. She screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that echoed off the walls of the alley. A sound that sent a shiver of pleasure down my spine. I pulled the hatchet free, blood spurting from the wound, and swung again, harder this time. Her body convulsed, her hands clawing at the ground, her screams growing weaker with each passing second. I kept swinging, each blow more powerful, more satisfying than the last, until her screams were nothing more than a gurgling whisper, her body a broken, bloody mess. When it was over, I stood over her, panting, my heart racing with adrenaline. I looked down at her lifeless body, at the pool of blood spreading out beneath her, and I smiled. I was art. I was alive, and I wasn't done yet. I wiped the blood from my face, smearing my painted smile, and walked away, leaving her body behind, the hatchet dangling from my hand. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the rush of excitement. I knew I couldn't stop now. I didn't want to stop. I needed more. I needed to feel that power again, to see the fear in their eyes, to hear their screams, to feel their blood on my hands. I was becoming art, and I loved every second of it. As I disappeared into the night, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer nothing. I was Art the Clown, and the world would remember me.
I've always hated Halloween. The fake blood, the garish costumes, and the endless parade of children begging for candy. It all seemed so pointless, so beneath me. But everything changed the night I watched Terrifier. I didn't know what to expect. I thought it would be just another cheap slasher flick. I was wrong. From the moment Art the Clown appeared on screen, I was mesmerized. There was something about him, his silent demeanor, the exaggerated facial expressions, the sheer brutality of his actions, that spoke to me on a deep, primal level. He didn't need to speak to convey his madness. It was all there, in his eyes, his smile, the way he moved. It was like he was inviting me into his world, showing me a path I never knew existed. I couldn't get him out of my head. His painted face haunted my thoughts, lingering in my mind's eye every time I closed my eyes. I saw him in the shadows of my room, in the corners of my vision, even in my own reflection. It was like he was there with me, whispering to me without words, telling me to embrace the darkness inside. I started watching the movie over and over, each time finding new nuances in his performance, new depths to his madness. I began to wonder what it would feel like to be him, to have that kind of power, that ability to inspire fear with a single look. The thought consumed me. I knew what I had to do. I needed to become him. I ordered a clown costume online, one as close to Art's as I could find, black and white, with ruffles around the neck and cuffs. It arrived a week later, the fabric coarse and scratchy against my skin. I slipped it on, feeling the weight of it, the way it hung on my body. It was like wearing a second skin. I found an old pair of oversized shoes at a thrift store, their soles worn and cracked. They were a bit too big, but I didn't care. I practiced walking in them, mimicking Art's strange, exaggerated gait. Then came the makeup. I studied his face for hours, analyzing every detail, the hollow black eyes, the wide, toothy grin, the pale white skin. I bought a set of grease paints from a costume shop and began practicing. It took time to get it right, but eventually I perfected it. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself anymore. I saw Art, I felt a thrill of excitement, a rush of adrenaline. It was like he was inside me, guiding my hand, whispering in my ear. The transformation was complete. I was ready. I decided to start small. There was a young couple who lived a few blocks away. They were always out late at night, walking their dog. I began to follow them, lurking in the shadows, watching from a distance. They never noticed me. I was a ghost, invisible, just like art. I could feel my heart racing with anticipation every time I saw them. The thrill of the hunt. I knew their route by heart, knew where they would be and when. I waited for the perfect moment, biding my time, savoring the anticipation. One night, I followed them down a dark alley, my gloved hands gripping the handle of a rusty hacksaw I had found in my grandfather's old tool shed. The blade was dull and covered in rust, but it would do the job. I waited until they were halfway through the alley before I made my move. I stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. At first, they laughed. They thought I was some Halloween prankster, just another weirdo in a costume. But when I slowly pulled the hacksaw from behind my back, their laughter died. I could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that this was real. They turned to run, but I was faster. I grabbed the man by his collar, yanking him back with a force that surprised even me. He stumbled, his feet slipping on the wet pavement, and fell to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I swung the hacksaw down with all my might, the blade biting into his shoulder, slicing through flesh and bone. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed off the walls of the alley, a sound that sent a shiver of pleasure down my spine. The woman was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. I could see her trembling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She tried to pull out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. But I was on her before she could even dial. I swung the hacksaw again, aiming for her neck this time. It wasn't a clean cut. The blade got stuck halfway through, catching on bone. I had to pull it out and swing again, harder this time. Her blood sprayed across my face, warm and sticky, mixing with my makeup. It was beautiful, the way it painted my costume, my face. I felt like I was part of a masterpiece, a work of art. When it was over, I stood over their lifeless bodies, panting, my heart racing with adrenaline. I looked down at my blood-soaked costume, at the bodies lying in twisted, unnatural positions, and I smiled. It was a feeling like no other, pure, unadulterated power. I felt like a god, like I had the power to create and destroy. I understood now why art smiled so much. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the art, the creation of something beautiful in its own twisted way. I walked away, leaving their bodies behind, the hacksaw dangling from my hand. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the rush of excitement. I knew I couldn't stop now. I didn't want to stop. I needed more. I needed to feel that power again, to see the fear in their eyes, to hear their screams. I was becoming art, and I loved every second of it.
I wasn't looking for inspiration that night. I was just flipping through channels, bored out of my mind. I stopped on a horror movie, something I wouldn't normally watch, but there was something about it that caught my eye. The way the camera moved, the way the shadows played across the screen, and then I saw him, Art the Clown. At first, I thought he was just another killer in a cheap slasher flick, but there was something different about him, something mesmerizing. He moved with a strange grace, his silence more terrifying than any scream. He didn't need words to convey his madness. It was all there in his eyes, his smile, the way he tilted his head as if considering his next move. I watched, transfixed, as he went about his gruesome work. There was a certain artistry to it, a meticulousness that spoke to me on a deep level. It was like watching a painter at work, each stroke of his knife a brushstroke on a canvas of flesh. I found myself leaning forward, my heart racing with anticipation. I wanted to know more about him, about what made him tick. I wanted to feel what he felt. I watched the movie over and over, each time finding new details, new layers to his character. I began to imagine what it would be like to be him, to walk in his shoes, to see the world through his eyes. The thought consumed me. I started having dreams about him, Dreams where I was the one holding the knife, the one making the cuts, feeling the blade sink into flesh. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, my body trembling with excitement. I knew what I had to do. I needed to become him. I started with my neighbors. They were a quiet couple, always kept to themselves. They were perfect. I began watching them, learning their routines, their habits. I noticed they kept their back door unlocked at night. It was almost like they were inviting me in, like they wanted me to do it. I waited for the right moment, for the perfect night. I chose a cold, moonless night when the streets were empty, the world quiet. I slipped into their house, wearing the costume I had meticulously prepared, black and white, just like Art's, complete with the pale, grinning mask. The house was dark, silent except for the soft sound of their breathing. I moved through the hallways like a shadow, my footsteps silent on the carpet. I could hear their soft snores from the bedroom, the sound of their lives ticking away. The anticipation was intoxicating. I held a butcher knife in one hand and a hammer in the other, the weight of the tools familiar and comforting. I felt like a conductor preparing for a symphony, every muscle in my body taut with anticipation. I entered their bedroom, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet. I approached the bed slowly, savoring the moment, the thrill of what was to come. I lifted the hammer first, bringing it down on the man's head with a sickening crunch. His eyes flew open, his mouth opening in a silent scream. I hit him again and again, each blow more powerful, more satisfying than the last, until his head was nothing but a pulpy mess of blood and bone. His wife woke up, her eyes wide with horror, her mouth opening in a scream that never came. Before she could make a sound, I shoved the knife into her throat, feeling the blade cut through muscle and sinew. Blood spurted out, splattering my face, the metallic scent filling my nostrils. She gurgled, choking on her own blood, her hands clawing at the air, at her own neck as if she could somehow stop the flow. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror, pleading, but I felt nothing. I twisted the knife, savoring the sensation of the blade cutting through flesh and cartilage, the way her blood felt as it poured over my hand, warm and thick. She convulsed, her body jerking uncontrollably, her life slipping away with each passing second. When it was over, I stood there, panting, covered in their blood. The room was filled with the stench of death, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I looked at the carnage I had created, at the lifeless bodies lying on the bed, their blood pooling on the sheets, and I felt satisfied. A sense of calm washed over me, a feeling I had never experienced before. I had never felt so alive, so powerful. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to leave a message, something to let the world know that this wasn't just a random act of violence. I wanted them to know that Art the Clown was real, that he lived on in me. I took out a small jar of black paint I had brought with me and dipped my fingers into it. I painted a large, smiley face on the wall, just like Art's, the paint dripping down in thick black streaks. It was perfect, a work of art. I stood back, admiring my handiwork, feeling a sense of pride swell within me. I wanted to laugh, to dance, to scream. I felt like I had finally found my purpose. As I walked out of the house, the cool night air hit my face, the scent of blood still clinging to my nostrils. I felt exhilarated, powerful, like I was invincible. I couldn't wait to do it again. I wanted to feel that rush, that power, that control. I wanted to see the fear in their eyes, to hear their screams, to feel their blood on my hands. I was becoming Art, and I loved every second of it. I went home, cleaned myself up, and sat in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. The paint was smeared, my hair matted with sweat and blood, but I didn't care. I could see him in my eyes, could feel him inside me. I smiled, a wide, toothy grin, and for the first time, I felt truly happy.